The shackles were the first thing I noticed when I woke up. Heavy adamantium restraints that bit into my wrists and ankles, connected by chains that allowed just enough movement to walk, but not enough to run. The metal was cold against my skin, and I could feel the neural inhibitors built into the shackles humming against my bones. One wrong move, one attempt to remove them, and they would send enough electrical current through my nervous system to drop me unconscious. My name is Sergeant Marcus Caney, former 47th Cadian Shock Regiment, current designation P7739 of the 13th Penal Legion. 3 days ago, I was a decorated veteran with 12 years of faithful service to the Emperor. Today, I am property of the Imperium, sentenced to die in whatever hellhole they see fit to throw me into. The cell they had placed me in was barely large enough to lie down, carved from raw rockcrete and lit by a single flickering lumen strip. The walls were covered in scratches, tally marks left by previous occupants counting down their days, messages of despair carved with fingernails and makeshift tools, prayers to the Emperor that had gone unanswered. Some of the messages were in languages I didn't recognize, suggesting that penal legions drew their numbers from across the galaxy. Day 1247, still breathing, read one set of scratches near the floor. Day 1248, they took Hendrix today. Day 1249, why won't the Emperor let me die? The progression of despair was obvious in the increasingly shaky handwriting, the growing desperation of someone who had given up hope of ever seeing freedom again. I tried to remember exactly how I had ended up here, but the events leading to my arrest were still hazy. The commissars had drugged me during the tribunal, standard procedure for trials involving military personnel who might pose a threat. What I could recall was fragments, raised voices in the command bunker, accusations of cowardice, the cold eyes of Commissar Vex as he read my sentence. Dereliction of duty in the face of the enemy, the charges had read. Failure to maintain discipline among subordinate troops. Questioning of lawful orders from superior officers. Each accusation had been technically accurate, but they failed to capture the context that had driven me to those actions. We had been ordered to hold position Sigma 7 against an Orc advance that outnumbered us 50-1. The position was strategically worthless, a bombed-out chemical plant on the outskirts of a city that had already fallen. But command had decided it was important for morale purposes to make a stand there, regardless of the cost in human lives. I had watched 37 men under my command die in the first wave alone, cut down by Orc choppas and Daka guns as they followed orders to charge across open ground with nothing but laser guns and bayonets. When Colonel Vashti ordered a second assault on the same position, using the same tactics, I had voiced my concerns, politely, respectfully, following proper chain of command. When he ordered a third assault, I had been more forceful in my objections. The men were exhausted, demoralized, and facing impossible odds. A tactical withdrawal would have saved lives while accomplishing the same strategic objective. But Colonel Vashti had been more concerned with his reputation than the lives of his soldiers. The final straw had come when he ordered Private Jensen, barely 18 years old and shaking with terror, to carry a message across a stretch of ground that was under constant enemy fire. It was a death sentence disguised as a military necessity. When I refused to give the order and suggested using the Vox instead, Vashti had me arrested on the spot. The tribunal had lasted less than an hour. Military justice in the Imperial Guard was swift and merciless, designed more to maintain discipline than to establish actual guilt or innocence. The testimony of Colonel Vashti carried more weight than a dozen character witnesses or a service record spanning over a decade. The accused has demonstrated a pattern of insubordination that undermines military discipline and threatens operational effectiveness. Commissar Vex had intoned in that flat, emotionless voice all political officers seemed to perfect. While his motives may have been understandable from a human perspective, the Imperium requires soldiers who obey orders without question, regardless of personal concerns or individual judgment. I had tried to explain the tactical situation, to justify my actions in terms of military necessity and the preservation of Imperial assets. But the Commissariat was not interested in tactical discussions. They were interested in making an example, showing the rest of the regiment what happened to officers who placed the lives of their men above absolute obedience to orders. The sentence of this tribunal is assignment to a penal legion for a period of no less than 5 years, or until death in service to the Emperor, whichever comes first, Vex had announced. May the Emperor have mercy on your soul, because the Imperium will not. 5 years. In a penal legion, that might as well have been a death sentence. I had heard the stories, whispered in barracks and mess halls across the Imperial Guard. Penal legions were where the Imperium sent its most expendable soldiers, criminals, cowards, and dissidents who could still be useful as cannon fodder. They were given the most dangerous assignments, equipped with the worst gear, and led by officers who viewed them as completely disposable. The door to my cell clanged open with a sound like a death knell, and a figure in the black uniform of the Departamento Munitorum stepped inside. He was a thin man with pale skin and the augmatic eyes of someone who spent his days processing vast amounts of data. When he spoke, his voice had the bored tone of someone who had performed this task thousands of times before. Prisoner P7739, he announced, consulting a data slate without looking at me. You are hereby assigned to the 13th Penal Legion, currently stationed on the world of Mordian Tertius. Your transport departs in 1 hour. Any personal effects you possessed have been confiscated by the state. Your previous rank and decorations are hereby revoked. You will be issued standard Penal Legion equipment upon arrival at your new unit. He paused to make a notation on his slate before continuing. Be advised that attempted escape from a penal legion is punishable by death. Failure to follow orders from superior officers is punishable by death. Any action deemed detrimental to imperial interests is punishable by death. Survival of your sentence depends entirely on your usefulness to the Imperium and the mercy of the Emperor. The mercy of the Emperor. I had served the Emperor faithfully for 12 years, had bled for him on a dozen different worlds, had watched good men die in his name. If this was his mercy, I wondered what his wrath looked like. Do you have any questions regarding your assignment? The Munitorum official asked. What happened to my men? I asked. The soldiers under my command when I was arrested. Are they safe? He consulted his data slate again, scrolling through information with mechanical precision. The survivors of the 47th Cadian's 3rd Company were reassigned to other units within the regiment. Casualties from the final assault on position Sigma 7 were within acceptable parameters for the tactical objective achieved. How many casualties? That information is classified, he replied without emotion. Your concern for former subordinates is noted but irrelevant to your current status. You are no longer an officer of the Imperial Guard. You are a convicted criminal whose life belongs to the Imperium to dispose of as it sees fit. The transport to Mordian Tertius was a converted bulk freighter that had seen better decades. The hull was pitted with micrometeorite impacts and scorched by weapons fire, while the interior had been hastily modified to accommodate human cargo rather than commercial goods. The passenger compartment was a single massive hold divided into cage-like sections, each one packed with new arrivals to various penal legions throughout the sector. I found myself assigned to Cage 7, along with 19 other prisoners whose crimes ranged from desertion to heresy to simple bad luck. The man beside me introduced himself as Tobias Grent, former corporal in the Valhallan Ice Warriors, convicted of falling asleep on sentry duty during an engagement that had cost his unit 12 men. "Wasn't even my fault," he explained as the transport shuddered into warp space. "Been awake for 36 hours straight because our lieutenant was too proud to admit he didn't have enough men to maintain proper watch rotations. But when the orcs overran our position, someone had to take the blame. Easier to court-martial one corporal than admit the whole operation was understaffed." Across from us sat a woman who couldn't have been much older than 25, her dark hair cropped short in military fashion. She introduced herself as Elena Vasquez, former tech adept attached to the Mordian Iron Guard. Her crime had been questioning the wisdom of using certain archaeotech weapons against a Tyranid swarm. "The devices were clearly corrupted by Xenos influence," she explained quietly, careful not to let her voice carry to the other cages. "Using them would have been tantamount to heresy. But the Magos in charge of the expedition was more concerned with recovering ancient technology than protecting Imperial forces from contamination. When I refused to activate the weapons, he had me arrested for insubordination." Story after story, each one following the same pattern. Soldiers who had tried to do the right thing in impossible situations, who had placed human concerns above absolute obedience to orders, who had discovered that the Imperium valued compliance over competence. We were not criminals in any meaningful sense. We were casualties of a system that demanded perfection from imperfect beings. But scattered among the genuine victims were others whose presence was more troubling. Private Hendricks, convicted of murdering a fellow soldier during an argument over rations. Sergeant Kroll, caught selling Imperial equipment to black market dealers on a dozen different worlds. Corporal Vance, whose squad had accidentally opened fire on a refugee convoy they had been ordered to protect. These men looked at the rest of us with the calculating eyes of predators who had found themselves among sheep. They had committed genuine crimes, real violations of Imperial law and military discipline. But in the eyes of the Penal Legion system, there was no distinction between a soldier who had refused an unlawful order and one who had murdered his comrades for profit. The journey to Mordian Tertius took 3 weeks in warp space, 3 weeks of gradually deteriorating conditions as the ship's life support systems struggled to accommodate a cargo load they had never been designed for. The air grew stale and thick, recycled through filters that couldn't quite remove the stench of unwashed bodies and human waste. Rations were distributed twice daily, thin gruel that tasted like recycled protein paste mixed with synthetic vitamins. But worse than the physical discomfort was the psychological pressure of being locked in close quarters with men and women who had nothing left to lose. Fights broke out regularly, brutal affairs that the ship's crew ignored unless they threatened to damage the transport systems. The stronger prisoners claimed the better sleeping spots and larger rations, while the weak were forced to survive on scraps and find rest wherever they could. I watched Elena trade away her daily meal for protection from 3 men who had been taking turns visiting the female prisoners during the night shift. She was tough, tougher than her slight frame suggested, but even a trained tech adept couldn't fight off multiple attackers in the confined space of the transport cage. "You could help her," Tobias observed as we watched the transaction take place. And then what? I replied. Get myself killed defending someone I barely know? We're all dead men anyway. Might as well save our strength for whatever's waiting for us on Morty Tertius. But even as I said the words, I knew they were wrong. This was how the system broke you down, how it turned decent people into the monsters it claimed they already were. By forcing you to choose between self-preservation and basic human decency, it gradually stripped away everything that made life worth living. The next time the three men approached Elena, I was waiting for them. The fight was brief but vicious. In the confined space of the transport cage, there was no room for fancy tactics or elaborate maneuvers. It came down to who was willing to inflict the most damage in the shortest amount of time. The first man went down when I drove my knee into his solar plexus hard enough to crack ribs. The second hesitated long enough for Tobias to grab him from behind, giving me the opening I needed to disable him with a chokehold. The third man was smarter than his companions. Instead of attacking immediately, he backed away and addressed the entire cage. "You want to play hero, Sergeant?" he called out, using my former rank like a curse word. "That's fine. But remember that we're going to be on the same side when we reach our destination. Might not be smart to make enemies before the real fighting starts." His name, I learned later, was Mordecai Thorne, and he had been a gang leader in the underhive of some forgotten world before being conscripted into the Imperial Guard. His conviction had been for running a protection racket that targeted civilian refugees in a war zone, forcing desperate families to pay for security that consisted mainly of protection from Thorne himself. "You think you're better than us," he continued, his voice carrying clearly through the cage. "Still acting like you're an officer, like your opinion matters. But you're here same as the rest of us. The Imperium threw you away, declared you worthless. So maybe it's time to stop pretending you're still one of the good guys." The words stung because they contained just enough truth to be painful. I had been thrown away, declared worthless by the same system I had served faithfully for over a decade. My attempts to maintain some semblance of honor and decency in this place might well be nothing more than stubborn pride, a refusal to accept what I had become. But Elena caught my eye across the cage and nodded once, a small gesture of gratitude that somehow made the aching ribs and split knuckles worthwhile. If maintaining my humanity made me weak in the eyes of men like Thorne, then weakness was something I could live with. When we finally arrived at Morty Tertius, the first thing that struck me was the smell. Even filtered through the ship's atmospheric processors, the air carried the stench of industrial pollution and chemical warfare. The planet's surface was a wasteland of ruined cities and poisoned rivers, the result of centuries of warfare between Imperial forces and various enemy factions. The spaceport where we disembarked was little more than a landing pad surrounded by prefabricated buildings and defensive walls. Guard towers manned by soldiers in the gray uniforms of the Mortian Iron Guard overlooked the facility, their heavy weapons trained not outward against potential enemies, but inward toward the landing pad where new arrivals were processed. "Welcome to hell," muttered one of the transport crew as the cargo doors opened. "Try not to die too quickly. The paperwork's a nightmare." We were herded off the transport in groups of 20, our shackles connecting us in long chains that made escape impossible and coordinated movement difficult. The Mortian guards who received us wore full environmental gear, their faces hidden behind rebreather masks that made them look like mechanical insects. They spoke in the clipped, precise tones of soldiers who had long since stopped seeing their charges as human beings. "Form up in ranks of 4, one of them commanded through his mask's Vox grill. Anyone who breaks formation will be shot. Anyone who attempts to flee will be shot. Anyone who fails to immediately obey orders will be shot. This is the only warning you will receive. The processing facility was a study in bureaucratic efficiency. We were moved through a series of stations where various officials recorded our details, assigned our new unit designations, and issued our equipment. Each step was performed with the mechanical precision of people who had done this thousands of times before, processing human cargo with the same attention to detail they might give to ammunition or rations. At the first station, a munitorum clerk recorded our basic information: name, age, former unit, conviction details. At the second, a tech priest performed medical scans to determine our physical condition and identify any augmetics or hidden weapons. At the third, an commissariat official reviewed our psychological profiles and assigned threat classifications. Previous rank, Sergeant, the commissar noted as he reviewed my file. Conviction, insubordination and dereliction of duty. Threat assessment, moderate to high. Special notations. Leadership experience may pose disciplinary challenges. He made several marks on his data slate before looking up at me with the cold eyes of someone who had never doubted the righteousness of his cause. Be advised, former Sergeant Caney, that any attempt to assume leadership among your fellow convicts will be met with immediate execution. You are no longer an officer. You are no longer a soldier. You are a resource to be expended in service to the Emperor. The equipment issue was an exercise in calculated humiliation. Instead of the reliable laser gun I had carried as a guardsman, I was issued a weapon that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts. The power pack was cracked, the barrel was slightly bent, and the firing mechanism stuck every third shot. It was the kind of weapon that might explode in your hands rather than hitting your intended target. My uniform was similarly degraded, a gray jumpsuit marked with the skull and chains symbol of the Penal legions, made from fabric so thin it would provide no protection against the elements. The boots were mismatched and several sizes too large, while the helmet was a battered piece of plasteel that would probably cave in if struck by anything heavier than raindrops. Standard Penal Legion kit, the supply sergeant explained with obvious satisfaction. If you survive long enough to prove your worth, you might earn better equipment. Until then, make do with what you're given and be grateful for the opportunity to serve. But it was the collar that truly drove home the reality of our situation. A band of adamantium and blessed silver that locked around the neck, fitted with an explosive charge powerful enough to separate head from shoulders with the press of a button. Each collar was keyed to a specific frequency, allowing our handlers to execute individual troublemakers without affecting the rest of the unit. Disciplinary collars, the tech priest who fitted them explained in his mechanical voice. Tamper-proof, psychically warded, and equipped with location beacons. Attempting to remove them will result in immediate detonation. The control frequencies are known only to your commanding officers and political commissars. I felt the cold metal settle around my throat like a physical representation of my new status. I was no longer a soldier serving the Emperor by choice. I was a slave whose life could be ended on a whim by anyone with the proper authorization codes. The final station was perhaps the most degrading of all. Here, a ministorum priest performed what he called a blessing ceremony, a ritual designed to remind us that we were no longer considered fully human in the eyes of the imperial faith. We were made to kneel while he recited passages from the Lectitio Divinitatus about redemption through suffering and the necessity of purging corruption from the soul. "You have fallen from grace," he intoned, as sacred oils were daubed on our foreheads. You have proven unworthy of the trust placed in you by the Emperor and his servants. But in his infinite mercy, you are granted this opportunity to redeem yourselves through sacrifice. Embrace death in service to the throne, and perhaps your souls may yet find peace. The blessing felt more like a funeral rite, an acknowledgement that we were already dead in all the ways that mattered. Whatever happened to us from this point forward, we would not be returning to the lives we had known. The men and women who had entered this facility no longer existed. They had been replaced by numbered assets whose only value lay in their willingness to die when ordered. Our new home was Compound Sigma 12, a collection of prefabricated buildings surrounded by razor wire and defensive positions. The compound had been built to house a regiment of regular Imperial Guard, but it was currently occupied by the remnants of 3 different penal legions, whose numbers had been depleted by combat losses. The 13th Penal Legion, to which I had been assigned, consisted of roughly 200 men and women drawn from military units across the sector. Some were genuine criminals who deserved their fate, but most were soldiers like myself, who had found themselves on the wrong side of military justice for reasons ranging from bad luck to moral integrity. Our commanding officer was Colonel Marcus Vane, a former Praetorian Guard officer who had been demoted and reassigned after a scandal involving the misappropriation of regimental funds. He was a hard man with the scarred face of someone who had seen too much combat, but there was a weariness in his eyes that suggested he understood the injustice of our situation. "I'm not going to pretend this is a normal military unit," he told us during our first formation. "You're here because someone decided you were more useful as expendable assets than as regular soldiers. My job is to make sure you die in a way that serves Imperial interests. Your job is to stay alive long enough to make your deaths worthwhile." He paused to scan our ranks, his gaze lingering on those of us who bore the marks of former officers. "Some of you still think like soldiers. That's good. It means you might actually accomplish something before you die. But don't make the mistake of thinking this is about redemption or second chances. This is about the Imperium squeezing the last bit of usefulness out of assets it considers damaged goods." The compound's facilities were basic, but functional. Barracks that had been designed for regular troops, but were now overcrowded with penal legionnaires. A mess hall that served rations barely adequate for survival. Training areas where we were expected to maintain combat readiness despite our degraded equipment and precarious morale. But the most prominent feature of the compound was the gallows that stood in the center of the parade ground. A simple wooden structure that could accommodate up to 6 prisoners at once, it served as a constant reminder of what happened to those who failed to meet expectations. Fresh graves in the field beyond the compound walls testified to its regular use. 3 executions this week, Tobias observed as we were assigned to our barracks. Apparently, some members of the 7th Penal refused a direct order to assault a fortified position without artillery support. The barracks themselves were a study in barely controlled chaos. Men and women who had once been professional soldiers now lived like prisoners in an overcrowded cell. Bunks were assigned based on seniority and strength, with newcomers forced to sleep on the floor or find space wherever they could. Personal possessions were limited to whatever could fit in a single footlocker, and even those were subject to random searches by the compound's security forces. My bunkmate was a former Catechin sergeant named Rivera, who had been convicted of excessive enthusiasm during an anti-insurgency operation. His unit had been ordered to clear a rebel stronghold with minimal civilian casualties, but Rivera's methods had been too brutal even by Imperial Guard standards. "Burned out 3 city blocks getting to the target," he explained matter-of-factly as he showed me around our new home. Command said I should have been more surgical, more precise. But you can't fight insurgents with kid gloves. Sometimes you have to send a message that scares the survivors more than it hurts the dead. He was a dangerous man, but not necessarily an evil one. The line between necessary brutality and war crimes was often razor-thin in the Imperial Guard, and it was easy for good soldiers to find themselves on the wrong side of it. Rivera had simply been unlucky enough to be caught when the political winds shifted and the High Command needed scapegoats for an operation that had gone bad. Our first mission briefing came 3 days later, delivered by Colonel Vane with the clinical detachment of someone announcing weather conditions. We were to assault a rebel stronghold in the ruins of Hive Mortalis, a city that had been under siege for the past 18 months. Regular Imperial Guard units had made 3 previous attempts to take the position, each one failing with heavy casualties. Intelligence suggests the rebels have established a command center in the city's former cathedral, Vane explained, indicating positions on a holographic map. The building is heavily fortified and defended by approximately 200 insurgents armed with stolen Imperial equipment. Your objective is to clear the structure and eliminate all enemy personnel. The plan was simple in the way that only suicide missions could be simple. We would approach the cathedral through the city's ruined streets, fight our way through multiple defensive positions, and storm a fortified building defended by enemies who knew we were coming. No artillery support, no air cover, no backup plan if things went wrong. "Sir," I found myself saying before I could stop myself, "the tactical situation seems to favor the defenders significantly. Perhaps if we coordinated with regular guard units or waited for heavy weapon support." "Former Sergeant Caney," Vane interrupted, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had expected this objection. "You seem to be operating under the misapprehension that your tactical opinions are welcome here. They are not. Your job is to follow orders, not to evaluate their wisdom." He activated a control device on his belt, and I felt the disciplinary collar around my neck grow warm. Not enough to cause serious damage, but enough to remind me of what would happen if I pressed the issue. The message was clear. Questioning orders was not just discouraged, it was potentially fatal. "The mission parameters are not subject to debate," Vane continued. "You will assault the cathedral using the route and tactics specified in your briefing materials. You will accomplish your objectives or die in the attempt. There is no third option." Looking around the briefing room, I could see similar expressions of resignation on the faces of my fellow convicts. We all understood the reality of our situation. This wasn't a military operation designed to achieve victory. It was an execution disguised as a combat mission. We were being sent to die, and everyone in the room knew it. The night before the mission, the compound took on the atmosphere of a funeral wake. Men and women who had served the Emperor faithfully for years prepared for what they knew would likely be their final battle. Some wrote letters to families they would never see again. Others prayed to an emperor who seemed to have abandoned them. A few simply drank themselves into oblivion with whatever alcohol they could acquire through trade or theft. Elena found me sitting on my bunk, cleaning the inadequate weapon I had been issued for what felt like the 100th time. The firing mechanism still stuck, the power pack still leaked energy, and the barrel still threw shots wide at anything beyond close range. But maintaining the weapon gave me something to do with my hands, while my mind processed what was about to happen. "Scared?" she asked, settling down beside me on the narrow bunk. "Terrified," I admitted. "But not of dying exactly. I've been scared of that plenty of times before, and I always got through it. This is different. This feels like we're being murdered by our own side." She nodded, understanding exactly what I meant. In normal combat, soldiers faced the possibility of death in service to a cause they believed in. Here, we were being deliberately sacrificed to achieve objectives that probably could have been accomplished through other means. Our lives were being thrown away, not because it was necessary, but because we were convenient and expendable. My unit used to joke about penal legions, she said quietly. We'd threaten each other with assignment to one whenever someone complained about our orders or questioned our missions. Keep talking like that, and you'll end up digging trenches for convicts, we'd say. Never really thought about what it would be like to actually be one of those convicts. Any regrets? I asked. About refusing to activate those corrupted weapons? No. Those devices would have killed more of our own people than enemies. But I regret not finding a way to do it without getting caught. Maybe if I'd been smarter, more political, I could have prevented the disaster without destroying my own career. We sat in comfortable silence for a while. Two soldiers who had tried to do the right thing and been punished for it. Around us, the barracks buzzed with the quiet conversations of people who knew they were about to die. Some were making peace with their fate. Others were planning desperate escape attempts, and a few were already mentally rehearsing their final moments. If we somehow survive this, Elena said eventually, what happens then? We get sent on another mission just like it, I replied. And another one after that, until our luck runs out or our bodies give up. That's what penal legion service means. Death by installments, spread out over enough missions to extract maximum value from our corpses. Cheerful thought? Realistic thought. The Imperium doesn't believe in rehabilitation or second chances. Once you're declared expendable, you stay expendable until you're actually expended. The mission began at 0400 hours with a transport flight that took us from the relative safety of the compound to a landing zone on the outskirts of Hive Mortalis. The aircraft that carried us was an ancient Valkyrie gunship whose best days were decades behind it, its hull patched with spare parts and prayers to the machine spirits. The pilot was a veteran flyer who had clearly drawn punishment duty himself, probably for some minor infraction that had annoyed his superiors. He flew with the reckless skill of someone who no longer cared whether he lived or died, weaving through anti-aircraft fire with maneuvers that would have been impressive if they hadn't been so obviously suicidal. 30 seconds to drop, he announced over the Vox as the Valkyrie shuddered under the impact of small arms fire. Try not to all die at once. Makes the pickup easier if there are a few survivors to collect. The landing zone was a bombed-out plaza in what had once been the city's commercial district. Now it was a wasteland of rubble and twisted metal, overlooked by buildings that had been reduced to skeletal frameworks by months of bombardment. Steam rose from impact craters where chemical weapons had turned the ground itself into a toxic soup. We disembarked under fire, enemy snipers in the surrounding ruins picking off anyone who moved too slowly or in too straight a line. 3 men died before we even reached cover, their bodies left behind as we pushed forward toward our objective. There was no time to collect the dead or treat the wounded. The mission timeline didn't allow for such luxuries. The cathedral that housed our target was visible from the landing zone, its Gothic spires rising above the surrounding devastation like the ribs of some massive beast. Even at a distance, I could see the defensive positions that had been built into its structure. Heavy weapons emplacements, sniper nests, and kill zones designed to funnel attackers into carefully prepared ambush sites. Lovely place for a picnic, Rivera muttered as we took cover behind the wreckage of a burned-out transport. Think they'll have refreshments waiting for us when we arrive? The approach to the cathedral took us through 6 blocks of urban nightmare, each one more heavily defended than the last. The rebels had turned every building into a fortress, every street into a killing field. They knew we were coming, knew our route, and had prepared accordingly. It was like walking into a trap that everyone could see but no one could avoid. The first real firefight came at an intersection controlled by a rebel heavy weapons team. They had positioned an autocannon in the upper floor of a damaged habitation block, with clear lines of fire down all 4 approach routes. Any attempt to cross the intersection would result in immediate death for anyone not fast enough or lucky enough to make it to cover. "We need to flank them," I suggested to Sergeant Kowalski, the squad leader who had been placed in charge of our section. "Send a team around through the eastern building while the rest of us provide covering fire from here." "Negative," Kowalski replied, without taking his eyes off the enemy position. "Mission parameters specify a direct assault route. We go straight through, fast and hard, and hope enough of us make it across to assault the next position." It was tactical madness, but it was also exactly what the mission planners had expected. Our orders weren't designed to minimize casualties. They were designed to draw enemy fire and reveal defensive positions for the regular guard units that would follow up after we had been expended. We were reconnaissance by dying, gathering intelligence through the simple expedient of seeing what killed us. The assault across the intersection was a slaughter. Kowalski led the charge himself, his disciplinary collar ensuring that he couldn't refuse the order even if he wanted to. He made it perhaps 10 meters before the autocannon cut him in half, his body serving as a grotesque landmark for the rest of us to follow. I went next, sprinting across the open ground with my inadequate weapon clutched in sweating hands. The autocannon tracked toward me, its barrel swinging with mechanical precision, and I knew I was about to die. But Elena tackled me from behind, sending us both tumbling into a shell crater just as the heavy rounds chewed up the ground where I had been standing. "Stay down," she hissed as debris rained around us. "Let the others go first. No point in dying heroically when we can die tactically." It was sound advice, even if it felt like cowardice. 3 more men died crossing that intersection before Mordecai Thorne, of all people, managed to get close enough to the heavy weapon position to silence it with a grenade. He survived the explosion by pure luck, emerging from the smoke with a grin that suggested he had actually enjoyed the experience. "That's one down," he called out as we regrouped on the far side of the intersection. "How many more until we reach our lovely cathedral?" The answer, it turned out, was 17 more defensive positions, each one harder to overcome than the last. We lost people at every stop, good soldiers who died because they had been given impossible orders and inadequate equipment. By the time we reached the cathedral's outer perimeter, our force of 60 had been reduced to fewer than 20. But somehow, impossibly, we were still advancing. The rebels had expected us to break and run after the first few casualties, not to keep coming despite horrific losses. Our willingness to die in pursuit of our objectives was something they hadn't planned for, and it was giving us a tactical advantage that almost made up for our equipment disadvantages. The cathedral itself was a masterpiece of Gothic architecture that had been turned into a fortress of death. The rebels had blocked the main entrances with rubble and debris, forcing attackers to approach through a series of narrow passages that could be swept by overlapping fields of fire. Machine gun nests had been built into the flying buttresses, while snipers occupied positions in the bell towers. "Standard assault pattern," announced Lieutenant Vex, the political officer who had been assigned to ensure we followed our orders to the letter. "Frontal assault through the main entrance, overwhelming force applied to break through enemy defenses, no deviations from approved tactics. It was suicide, pure and simple. But we were past the point where such considerations mattered. We had come too far and lost too much to turn back now. If we were going to die, we might as well die accomplishing something. The final assault began with a prayer. Not to the Emperor, who seemed to have abandoned us, but to whatever gods might be listening to the desperate pleas of condemned soldiers. Then we charged, weapons firing, voices raised in the traditional battle cry of the Imperial Guard. "For the Emperor!" we screamed as we rushed toward certain death, but the words felt hollow, meaningless. We weren't dying for the Emperor. We were dying because we had become inconvenient to those who claimed to serve him. The cathedral's defenders were ready for us. Heavy bolter fire swept the approach routes, while snipers picked off anyone who tried to find cover. Explosives hidden in the rubble detonated as we passed, sending bodies flying in all directions. It was everything our tactical assessment had predicted, and worse. But we kept coming. Men and women who had been declared unfit for regular service showed the same courage and determination that had made them soldiers in the first place. Elena charged through a storm of gunfire to reach a machine gun position, buying precious seconds for the rest of us to advance. Rivera single-handedly cleared a sniper nest with nothing but a combat knife and pure rage. And somehow, incredibly, we broke through. The rebels' defenses collapsed under the sheer weight of our assault, not because we were better soldiers, but because we were more willing to die than they were to kill us. When the smoke cleared, the cathedral was ours, its defenders dead or fled. Of the 60 soldiers who had begun the mission, only 7 survived to see its completion. 7 broken, bleeding convicts who had accomplished the impossible simply because they had been given no choice but to succeed or die trying. We stood in the cathedral's ruined nave, surrounded by the bodies of friends and enemies alike, and tried to process what we had just survived. "Mission accomplished," Lieutenant Vex reported into his Voxcaster, his voice as emotionless as if he were reading a weather report. "Objective secured with acceptable losses. Recommend immediate reinforcement to hold position." Acceptable losses. 88% casualties were considered acceptable because the people who had died were expendable. The tactical objective had been achieved, and that was all that mattered to the Imperial war machine. The fact that it had cost the lives of 53 human beings was merely a footnote in someone's after-action report. But we had survived. Against all odds, despite inadequate equipment and suicidal orders, 7 members of the 13th Penal Legion had lived through an assault that should have killed us all. It was a small victory, but in our current circumstances, small victories were all we could hope for. The reinforcements that arrived to secure the position were members of the regular Mordian Iron Guard, professional soldiers with proper equipment and competent leadership. They looked at us with a mixture of surprise and disgust. Surprise that we had actually succeeded, and disgust at what we had become in the process. "Penal legionnaires," one of them muttered as they filed past us into the cathedral. "Barely human anymore. Look at them. They don't even care that most of their unit is dead." He was wrong, of course. We cared deeply about the men and women who had died beside us, but we had learned not to show that grief publicly, because grief was a luxury that penal legionnaires couldn't afford. Mourning the dead meant acknowledging that their lives had value, and that was a sentiment the Imperium actively discouraged among its expendable assets. The transport back to Compound Sigma-12 was conducted in the same Valkyrie that had brought us to the mission, though it felt different now. larger, emptier, haunted by the ghosts of those who would never make the return journey. The pilot's jokes seemed forced, his bravado hollow in the face of what we had just experienced. "Successful mission," he announced over the Vox as we lifted off. 70% casualties are well within expected parameters for Penal Legion operations. Command is pleased with the tactical results. Expected parameters. They had known from the beginning that most of us would die. The mission hadn't been planned to minimize casualties. It had been planned to achieve objectives regardless of casualties. We were ammunition to be expended, not soldiers to be preserved. Back at the compound, we were processed through the same bureaucratic machinery that had welcomed us as new arrivals. Medical examinations to assess our fitness for future missions. Debriefing sessions to extract tactical intelligence about enemy capabilities. Performance evaluations to determine which survivors were worth keeping and which should be assigned to even more dangerous duties. Your actions during the assault were noted by observing officers, Colonel Vane informed me during my individual assessment. You showed initiative and tactical awareness that exceeded expectations for a Penal Legionnaire. This has been noted in your file. I waited for him to explain what that meant, but he simply made another notation on his data slate and dismissed me. Later, I learned from other survivors that being noted for good performance was not necessarily a positive development. It often meant assignment to even more dangerous missions, on the theory that successful convicts could be pushed harder than unsuccessful ones. The weeks that followed blurred together into a routine of training, missions, and casualties. We assaulted rebel positions, cleared underground bunkers, and performed reconnaissance operations that regular guard units considered too dangerous for their personnel. Each mission cost lives, each success was purchased with blood, and each survivor faced the knowledge that their next assignment would likely be their last. Elena died on our fourth mission, cut down by enemy fire while trying to save a wounded squad mate. Rivera survived 7 missions before a booby trap took off his legs and left him to bleed out in a ruined factory. One by one, the people I had come to know and respect were ground up by the Imperial war machine and discarded like broken equipment. But new convicts arrived regularly to replace the dead, each one bringing their own story of how the system had failed them. Young soldiers who had made honest mistakes, veteran officers who had questioned unlawful orders, specialists who had placed human welfare above absolute obedience. They came from every branch of the Imperial military, united only by their shared status as expendable assets. Some adapted to their new circumstances better than others. The genuine criminals often thrived in the anarchic environment of Penal Legion service, their lack of moral constraints serving them well in situations where survival depended on being willing to do anything necessary. The honest soldiers struggled more, their ingrained sense of duty and honor proving to be liabilities in a system that rewarded ruthlessness over righteousness. I found myself changing as well, gradually losing the idealism that had gotten me into this situation in the first place. The man who had once risked his career to protect young Private Jensen was slowly being replaced by someone who understood that individual lives meant nothing compared to mission objectives. It was a transformation I could feel happening but seemed powerless to prevent. 6 months into my sentence, I was promoted to squad leader. Not because of any particular merit, but because I had survived longer than most of the other potential candidates. The promotion came with additional responsibilities, but no additional authority, since Penal Legion squad leaders were expected to die alongside their men rather than actually command them. Your job is to make sure they follow orders, Colonel Vane explained during my briefing. Nothing more, nothing less. If they refuse to advance, you advance anyway and hope they follow. If they break and run, You stay and complete the mission regardless. You are not their protector. You are their conscience, such as it is. The new squad assigned to me consisted of 8 men and women whose crimes ranged from desertion to heresy. Private Chen, the tech specialist who had been caught trying to desert before a suicidal assault. Corporal Martinez, who had been convicted of excessive force during civilian riot control. Sergeant Williams, a former stormtrooper who had been caught stealing supplies intended for refugee camps. They looked at me with the wary respect that penal legionnaires showed to anyone who had managed to survive more than a few missions. In their eyes, I was an old hand, a veteran of the system who might be able to teach them how to stay alive long enough to see their next birthday. The irony was that I had no idea how I had survived this long. Luck, stubbornness, and the deaths of better people seemed to be the only factors involved. Our first mission together was an assault on a chaos cult compound hidden in the ruins of an industrial complex. Intelligence indicated that the cultists were planning some kind of ritual that would summon demonic entities to the material plane. Our job was to disrupt the ceremony and eliminate all cult members before they could complete their summoning. Standard purge operation, the briefing officer explained with the casual tone of someone discussing routine maintenance. No prisoners, no survivors, no exceptions. Chaos corruption is to be burned out completely, regardless of the cost in Imperial lives. It was the kind of mission that penal legions were particularly suited for, one that required absolute ruthlessness and a willingness to accept massive casualties in pursuit of a vital objective. Regular guard units might hesitate when faced with civilians who had been corrupted by chaos. Penal legionnaires were expected to kill anything that moved and sort out the innocent from the guilty later. The compound was built around an abandoned chemical processing plant, whose toxic atmosphere made it nearly uninhabitable for normal humans. The cultists had adapted to the environment through a combination of surgical modification and demonic mutation, creating beings that were no longer entirely human, but were perfectly suited to their poisonous surroundings. Environmental suits are available but not required, our equipment officer announced, as we prepared for the mission. Penal legionnaires are expected to operate in toxic conditions without life support if necessary. Mission parameters do not allow for delays caused by equipment failures. In other words, we were expected to assault a toxic waste dump without proper protective gear, because replacing our equipment was more expensive than replacing us. It was exactly the kind of casual disregard for human life that I had come to expect from Penal Legion operations. The assault began at dawn, with our Valkyrie transport depositing us directly into the heart of the compound, rather than at a safe distance. The pilot's orders were to minimize flight time over the target area, even if it meant dropping us into immediate combat. Our lives were less valuable than his aircraft's maintenance schedule. The landing zone was a courtyard filled with industrial machinery that had been converted into altars and sacrificial platforms. The air was thick with toxic vapors that burned our lungs and made our eyes water, while the ground was slick with substances that might once have been human blood. At the center of the complex stood a massive structure that pulsed with unnatural light, clearly the focus of whatever ritual the cultists were attempting. "Cultists in the tower!" Chen shouted as enemy fire began to rake our position. "Heavy weapons? Looks like stubbers and maybe a heavy bolter." The enemy was better equipped than we had expected, with weapons that seemed to be a mixture of stolen Imperial technology and chaos-corrupted modifications. Their ammunition included rounds that exploded in bursts of unholy flame and bullets that screamed as they flew through the air. Fighting them was like battling nightmares made manifest. But we were veterans now, survivors of missions that had killed better soldiers than ourselves. We advanced through the compound with the mechanical precision of people who had learned to function in impossible circumstances. Martinez suppressed the heavy weapons position while Williams flanked around to assault it from the side. Chen set up his technical equipment to scan for additional threats, while I coordinated our movement toward the central structure. The ritual chamber was a horror beyond description. The cultists had covered the walls with symbols that hurt to look at directly, while the floor was covered with a mixture of blood, industrial chemicals, and things that defied identification. At the center of the room, a group of robed figures chanted around an altar where something that might once have been human was being slowly dismembered. "For the Emperor!" we screamed as we burst into the chamber, but the words felt wrong in this place. The very air seemed to reject our presence, and I could feel the weight of malevolent attention pressing down on us from dimensions beyond human understanding. The battle was brief but intense. The cultists fought with the desperate fury of people who knew that defeat meant not just death, but eternal damnation. Their weapons spat bullets that carried demonic corruption, while their chanted prayers called down curses that made our equipment malfunction and our wounds refuse to heal. But we prevailed, because that was what Penal legionnaires did. We died and killed in equal measure until the threat was eliminated and the ritual was broken. When the smoke cleared, 5 of my 8 squad members were dead, but the Chaos Cult had been purged completely. Another successful mission at an acceptable cost in human lives. "Mission accomplished," I reported into my Voxcaster as we secured the area. "Cult eliminated, ritual disrupted, compound secured for demolition." The words came automatically now, without emotion or inflection. I had learned to treat death and destruction as simply another part of the job, because acknowledging the human cost of our victories would have driven me insane long ago. The Marcus Caney who had once agonized over sending a single soldier into danger was gone, replaced by someone who could order men to their deaths without feeling anything at all. The survivors of my squad looked at me with a mixture of respect and fear. They had seen me fight with the same mechanical precision that I used for everything else, killing cultists with the same detachment I might show while cleaning my weapon. To them, I was exactly what a Penal Legion sergeant should be. Someone who had been so thoroughly broken by the system that he no longer felt anything human. They were right, of course. The gradual dehumanization that came with Penal Legion service had done its work on me just as thoroughly as it had on every other long-term survivor. I could still remember being horrified by injustice and moved by compassion, but those emotions felt like memories from someone else's life. What remained was a biological machine programmed to follow orders and complete missions regardless of the cost. The years that followed were more of the same. Mission after mission, each one designed to eliminate threats that regular Imperial forces couldn't or wouldn't handle. We purged chaos cults, cleared orc infestations, and eliminated heretic organizations that had taken root in Imperial territory. Each success was purchased with blood, each victory measured in acceptable losses rather than tactical achievement. I rose through the ranks of the Penal Legion hierarchy, not because of any particular skill, but simply because I continued to exist when others did not. Squad leader became platoon sergeant became company commander. Each promotion brought additional responsibilities, but no additional authority, since Penal Legion officers were still prisoners serving a sentence, rather than soldiers serving the Emperor. By the end of my 5-year sentence, I had become exactly what the system intended, a perfectly functional killing machine with no human weaknesses to interfere with mission effectiveness. The idealistic sergeant, who who had once risked his career to protect his men, was gone, replaced by someone who could order those same men to their deaths without feeling anything at all. When Colonel Vane called me to his office to discuss my upcoming release, I felt nothing. No anticipation, no relief, no fear of returning to civilian life. The emotions that should have accompanied such a momentous event had been systematically burned out of me by years of service in conditions designed to destroy everything human about the human soul. "Your sentence is complete," he announced, consulting the same type of data slate that had condemned me 5 years earlier. "According to Imperial law, you are eligible for release from Penal Legion service and return to civilian status. However, there is another option." He paused to activate a holo display that showed recruitment information for elite Imperial Guard units. "Your performance record indicates you might be suitable for assignment to stormtrooper companies or other specialized formations. The pay is better, the equipment is superior, and the survival rates are significantly higher than Penal Legion service." I studied the information without interest. Better pay, superior equipment, higher survival rates. None of it mattered to someone who no longer cared whether he lived or died. The man who might have been excited by such opportunities had been executed years ago in all but the most literal sense. "What would you recommend, sir?" I asked, because the question was expected, and I had been conditioned to give expected responses. "Honestly, stay with the Penal Legions. You've been broken down and rebuilt into something that functions perfectly in this environment, but you might not adapt well to normal military service. The standards are different, the expectations are different, and you've become something that those standards and expectations weren't designed to accommodate." He was right, of course. 5 years of Penal Legion service had transformed me into something that was no longer quite human, no longer capable of the moral flexibility that normal military service required. I could kill without hesitation, follow orders without question, and watch comrades die without emotional response. But I could no longer form the kinds of relationships that held normal military units together. "I'll stay," I decided, though the choice felt more like an acknowledgement of reality than an actual decision. "The Penal Legions are where I belong now." Colonel Vane nodded, unsurprised by my response. "Thought you might say that. Most long-term survivors make the same choice. The outside world doesn't have much use for what we've become." He was wrong about one thing, though. The Penal Legions weren't where I belonged. They were where I had been sent to be destroyed and rebuilt into something useful to the Imperium. The man who had entered this system no longer existed, replaced by a biological automaton that performed military functions with mechanical precision. And that, I realized, was exactly what the Imperium had intended all along. Not rehabilitation, not punishment, not even simple disposal of unwanted assets. The Penal Legion system was a factory for creating soldiers who had been stripped of everything that made military service a human endeavor. We were weapons that thought, tools that could follow complex orders, machines that happened to be made of flesh and bone instead of metal and circuitry. In the darkness of the first millennium, where there is only war, even the act of creating soldiers had become a form of industrial process. Feed in human beings who had shown inconvenient traces of conscience or compassion, subject them to conditions designed to burn away everything recognizably human about them, and output perfectly functional military assets with no inconvenient moral restraints. "The Emperor protects," they said. But sometimes protection required the destruction of everything worth protecting in the first place. And in the endless meat grinder of Imperial military service, that was a price the system was always willing to pay.